Hi, friends. I think I got my mic figured out, so hopefully I don't sound like I'm talking into a tin can anymore. But to be honest, I haven't really mastered the microphone on this yet. But anyway, chapter 7 ends with the revolution in Russia, which is such a momentous event. It's grouped into the end of the second or the First World War because it concluded in 1917 and 1918 and really set the stage for the end of World War One and a significant change in a political system that would take form in Russia. I want to briefly start again about the impact of geography and try to connect this to earlier lessons about the Industrial Revolution, which again began in England. While Russia did industrialize and became one of those 10 countries that was able to establish colonies in other parts of the world, even though Russia didn't have many, the sheer geographic size of the country made it just a slow moving process. We saw how industrialization slowly spread throughout Europe, and then Europe was able to colonize almost all of Africa and the Middle East and India, and then later on in China. Japan, again, we saw was the one exception, but this slow expansion of the Industrial Revolution, ideas, goods, technologies moving slowly, meant that Russia was behind the game in terms of other countries industrializing. I use an example of like Mario. If Russia was playing Mario Kart in the race to industrialization, like Russia is in last place. Like they're still industrializing, but they're slow. And this lack of industrialization, coupled with the highest population in, I should say, Europe, not Russia. Russia still had the largest population of any country in Europe, contributed to significantly high casualty rates suffered in the Russian army. The Russian soldiers were poorly equipped, they didn't have the same technologies. And at the end of the First World War, Russia was a country that was dragging. This led to an angry and starving population on the brink of collapse. Our textbook shows Russia mobilized more soldiers than any other country, had more soldiers killed than any other country. Germany just slightly above, according to this statistic, and suffered in 76% casualty rate. And that's just wild for the highest number of soldiers mobilized. So Russia at the end of the First World War is really a spent force and is really, really struggling. So, what actually happened? We have to go to the historical legacy of the Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia by for really over 300 years. This was a czarist regime, again, where there was still absolute control in the hands of a monarch. In Russia, it was a czar. There was this. There weren't checks on political power as there were in countries like England, like in France after the First World War, in Germany. So Russia, again, that intellectual revolution, those ideas of checks and balances had not yet taken root in Russia. Before World War One, a revolution in 1905 and a defeat by the Japanese left the Russian population feeling dismayed. At the time, the country's people began to feel that they were lagging behind the rest of Europe. During the First World War, there were stalemates, especially in the East, during the war, which contributed to a sense of major distrust. The population was upset that they were losing the war. Early on in the First World War, at the Battle of Tannenberg, there was almost an entire Russian army that was captured by the Germans. Tsar Nicholas II proved to be an ineffective ruler. He blocked all attempts to limit his power. We talk in class about how, you know, Nicholas II never chose the role that he was in, and you can dive into the character and the personality of people who make up history and their collective portraits. But he was an ineffective ruler, but you know what? He never really asked to be a ruler. So that can be a whole nother discussion point. But revolutionaries began to adopt what was called Marxist ideas while trying to ignite the proletariat. So this is how I cover the idea of Marxism in my class. This is my simplified version of it. It's not perfect, and you can find better instructional videos that are more intellectually engaging in trying to describe what Marxism was. But this is how I do it with my ninth graders. I put down Karl Marx was I think actually backtracking, everyone thinks socialism, communism, it's Russia. Yeah, okay. But the idea actually comes from Karl Marx, who was Prussian, and which would have been in today Germany. And he writes something called the Communist Manifesto along with Friedrich Engels, which is later adopted by Lenin. And it basically has according to this diagram, 2 points. There's capitalism and there's socialism. Marx argued in the Communist Manifesto that there were the rich, the middle class, the poor, and the powerless, and that capitalism was a system that benefited some to the dismay of others, and that it was an unfair system, especially for the poor and for the powerless, because they were trapped in a lifestyle in which they, no matter what they did, could never arise out of dismay or even poverty. So this system, according to Marx, is not fair. He proposed something else. He proposed this idea. Oh yeah, in capitalism there was competition, there was few winners, and there was many losers. Marx argued for something that he would call is socialism, in which this line right here is meant to distribute the government distributing money to individuals so that everybody has the same income, the same equality. There is no competition. There are equal winners and there are no losers. I use the names of students and their abbreviations. So I kind of show them what they would feel like over here. So TL, in this case, his name was Tyler. He was super pumped, but here he was a little upset. But these two kids, this was Ben. I don't remember who this was, but they were like, oh, okay, well, at least we're not, beneath the line of poverty. So this is, again, his idea. He put it down in the Communist Manifesto. Karl Marx came up with this idea while in London. And revolutionaries began to adopt Marxist ideas. While this is happening, so Marxism, this idea like, hey, let's try this out. Meanwhile, the First World War is still going on. Nicholas II goes to the front in an attempt to boost morale amongst the Russian soldiers, and it is probably the biggest public relations disaster in history. He doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know how to be a soldier, and he's viewed very negatively. So this is a very unpopular ruler at the end of World War I. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, there was an illiterate monk who claimed to possess healing power, who was attracted to the Tsarina Alexandra, who was at home, Nicholas II's wife, and allegedly cured the son of hemophilia. I need to go back and read the full story behind it, but had a lot of sway over the Tsarina while Nicholas II was gone, and the population kind of thought that was whack. His son was healed from hemophilia, even though the circumstances of everything that occurred are a little bit uncertain, but his attention was disliked by so many Russians. This idea that we are, by population-wise, the largest country in Europe, we're losing the war, and there's an illiterate homeless or illiterate monk who's calling the shots, like what's happening. He would eventually be assassinated in 1916, and there's all kinds of stories about, I think they tried to poison him, and it didn't work, but just read about the story of Rasputin. Interesting character. Under an immense pressure then, the Tsar abdicates in 1970. Nicholas II steps down and sets the stage for what would be the fight for Russia's political future. What would happen? Enter Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or who would later be known as Lenin. Who was he? He was born in 1870 to a middle-class family. He later adopted the name Lenin. And his brother was arrested, and he was hanged. My goodness, I'm sorry for the typos. For plotting to murder the Tsar. So Lenin's family comes from deep anger and animosity against the Tsar. There's a deep hatred of the Tsarist government for the rest of Lenin's life. He was introduced to the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and later began spreading the news of its promises, saying, socialism is the political form of government that Russia should adopt in order to ensure equality amongst all of the people. He married his wife, whose name I never pronounced correctly, and they continued to promote these Marxist ideas while they were exiled by the Tsarist government to Siberia. So he is living in exile in Siberia by no choice of his own, but he's still saying Marxism is the way that we should go. Later, he returns and he goes into exile in Switzerland, where he continues to promote the idea of socialism. He was living in Switzerland again because the Tsarist regime in Russia wouldn't allow this revolutionary to hold sway over the population. In 1917, Germany was still at war with Russia, and they realized that if they helped move Lenin from Switzerland to Russia, he might be able to stoke some kind of a revolution, which would thereby maybe come to terms with Germany and settle to a peace agreement. So The Germans put him on a secret train, send him to Russia, where he arrives and begins to promote this revolution, which will take hold of Russia. Now, there is a Karl Marx, who passed away by this point in time. He had a prediction about the future of communism, of socialism, and Lenin made a slight modification to it. Marx thought that the industrious workers would simultaneously rise up against the capitalists and demand changes. But he thought this would occur in more of the industrial countries like Germany, like England, like in France. You see, Russia, again, going back to its geography, was still slow to industrialize. There wasn't as large of a proletariat urban class that had been exploited by capitalists in Russia as there were in some of these other countries. So Marx actually didn't think that the revolution would happen in Russia. He thought it would happen in areas where the Industrial Revolution had held sway much more quicker, like again, like England, like in Germany. He didn't think it would be in Russia. Lenin makes an adjustment to it because, again, Russia didn't have large enough of a proletariat, a middle class of railway workers, of miners. So Lenin calls for, again, this elite dictatorship of the proletariat to represent socialists. So he's going to say, I'm going to represent your interests as a dictator of the proletariat. Even though there aren't enough of us, like Marx predicted, I'm going to lead us through this revolution that we are about to have. And while they were actually in the minority, Lenin gave the name, the political party, the Bolsheviks, which means majority, even though there wasn't a majority of the proletariat in Russia at this time. It was still a largely agrarian economy, a largely rural economy that didn't have the same kind of proletariat as other countries that had industrialized more quickly. So Marx makes that prediction. Lenin says, well, let's mix it up a little bit. So we get into the Russian Revolution, which concludes, which is right at the tail end of World War I. Lenin meets another exceptionally skilled orator and organizer, Leon Trotsky, who will also vie for political influence in Russia. They make this simple promise of peace, land, and bread, which becomes a very effective rallying cry to a population that had been at war for nearly 4 years, that had suffered a revolution 14 years earlier, suffered a defeat to the Japanese. When people are hungry, you say, I have bread. When people want land, you tell them that. When they want peace, you call them that. This becomes just this incredibly effective slogan for this population that's just been devastated. A provisional government after the Tsar had abdicated was established, known as the Kerensky government, which still believed that the war could be won. They pushed for one major offensive against Germany. It failed miserably, all ensuing that Russia would withdraw from the war. In November of 1917 is when armed Red Guards joined mutinous sailors and attacked the Kerensky government in major Russian cities. Moscow was taken and the Bolsheviks seized power. The Bolsheviks were renamed the Communists, and their first action was to pull Russia out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ensuring that Russia would no longer be fighting Germany, but Russia gave up a huge chunks of its territory and its population. But to the Bolsheviks, now the Communists, this was a victory. A war would still erupt within Russia about the future. The Reds would be known as the Communists, and counter-revolutionary groups known as the Whites would be the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks were people that were opposed to communism. They were people who held Tsarist sympathies still. The Romanovs are still alive at this point in time, and there's a battle between these two groups. The Allied powers in the war also sent soldiers to fight in the Russian Civil War. It's interesting, as soon as the Tsars abdicated, the Allies were hoping that the Kerensky government would eventually establish itself as a democratic republic, and that would be more favorable to the Allies. When the Bolsheviks took over, the Allies saw a political party that was unlike anything in France, unlike anything in England, unlike anything in the United States, and Allied powers sent soldiers to fight in the war on behalf of the Whites, trying to defeat the Reds. Britain, France, the United States, and Japan all had soldiers intervening in Russia's civil war. We'll see that the Reds will ultimately prevail in that war, and the fact that the Allies had soldiers fighting in Russia really upset the Bolsheviks. They saw this immense distrust in the Allies, saying, "Who are you to intervene in the political affairs of what was happening in Russia?" Nicholas and his family were eventually all executed by the Reds, and in order to ensure that the czars could never regain power, all of his family members were shot brutally, and Nicholas and his family were killed. The Russian Civil War began to turn brutal immediately following the end of the First World War. The communists organized a secret police known as the Cheka that would ensure all throughout Russia that communist sympathies and communist ideals were held by the population. It was used against whites and any Reds suspected of being disloyal to Marxism. There was a story of if there was a disruptful unit working the Reds, that 1 in every 10 soldiers would be shot. There was if there was whisperings of sympathies to the Tsar, there could be an execution on the spot. The rule of law began to disintegrate. Forced labor camps for political prisoners were established. Later on, this became known as the Gulag under Stalin. Labor camps that were used for political prisoners that would initially turn into gulags, in which Stalin later would orchestrate one of the biggest campaigns of genocide in history, or murder in history. And commissars were developed to teach party principles, meaning that we're going to ensure that communism is the preferred political system. It's almost like you adopt it without even thinking to. This political ad showed eventually the whites hopefully defeating the Reds, but that wasn't the case. The whites were defeated. The communists emerged victorious in the Russian Civil War. And by 1922, Lenin's communist government united much of the old Russian Empire into what became known as the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, which stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific, all the way into areas like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia. This is the formation of the Soviet Socialist Republic, the largest geographic entity that existed in the world. Lenin, interestingly, did adopt some democratic norms that eventually helped the economy. It was really struggling in the early 1920s. Some reforms were enacted which allowed more freedom of commerce and exchange. This is still in the world's first communist country. But Lenin dies in 1924, only at the age of, I think, 54. He wasn't old. And then Stalin emerges as the head of the next Soviet Union. Trotsky was his initially a contender to replace Stalin. They had a falling out. Stalin had Leon Trotsky executed in Mexico City in 1940, and our textbook tells us of the warnings of Stalin, I think, pretty succinctly. It says in 1922, Lenin had expressed grave doubts about Stalin's ambitious nature. Comrade Stalin has concentrated an enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution. Just as Lenin had warned, in the years that followed, Stalin used ruthless measures to win dictatorial power and change the course of history for the United Soviet Socialist Republic.